feels good. Every now and then you need a good old hymn sing and break out the parts. That's good stuff. Well, this is our last little section here in 1 Kings chapter 11. So if you have your Bible, let's crack it open. 1 Kings chapter 11. And this is the very tail end of our series, Life in the Pendulum, with King Solomon. Now, here today, we've got a culture in our society that we've got red cups from Starbucks. We've got people say happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, things like that. There's a culture of what I would say kind of suspicion in Christian circles regarding the issue of are we excluding Christ out of Christmas? So one of the questions that often crops up this time of year is one little phrase that we see used a lot, Xmas. Okay, you see this a lot. You're just really quick. You just scroll out Xmas. Now, I remember when I was in 8th grade, my science teacher went to a Christian school in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He said that Xmas was a ruse by people to exclude Christ out of Christmas. That X, in algebra, means the unknown value. So Christ being replaced with an X makes him unknown. So that was what my science teacher told me, but on the contrary, there's something that we need to take into consideration, that long before we had algebra in the modern sense, we had the Greek language. Now, in ancient Christian art, you have the Greek symbol chi. Okay, remember your Greek alphabet there. You got that looks like an X and XP. It's a chi. These are abbreviations that were used throughout history for Christ's name, and in many manuscripts of the New Testament and icons, that the letter X is actually an abbreviation for Christos. Okay, so whenever you see that X being used, it's actually meaning Christos. So you see this. We have our ichthus pasted on the back of our cars and things. You have these little letters. We say it's X or Y, but those are all Greek letters right there. And this, what it means, you have the I, which is Jesus, meaning Jesus. You have the X, meaning Christos or Christ. You have Theou, which means son of. You have Huios, which is God and Savior. So you put this all together, the X or Y thingy. It's Jesus, Christos, Theo, Irios, Soter, meaning Jesus, Christ, Son of God, Savior. Right there. The X right there meaning Christ. So you take this into account, and what happens here is the Oxford English Dictionary documents the use of X, this abbreviation, back to 1551, 50 years before the first English colonists arrived in North America, and 60 years before the King James Version. At the same time that this was used, you had Exian, meaning Christian, and you have Exianity, or Christianity, were in frequent use as abbreviations of Christian and Christianity. Now, long before we had modern algebra, we had the Greek language. Now, I don't use Xmas. I write out Christmas just for that, but I don't adhere to the notion that Xmas is taking Christ out of Christmas, because long before algebra, you had the Greek language, and they use this as a common abbreviation to denote Christ. Now, I don't adhere to that notion that we're taking Christ out of Christmas when we use that, but I do adhere to the notion that in our society we are quickly becoming a godless society. And that's something that we can all agree upon. And as a result of being godless, we become more hedonistic, more self-serving. And what I find that when you have a vacuum of leadership, when you exclude God out of our society, you have a vacuum there that there's a common reactionary movement of people to fill that vacuum. You take God out of the picture, so something has to replace God in that picture. Now, take for example what's happening in the news. Just even this past week, a couple of little interesting stories of just how we are trying to fill that vacuum of taking God out of our lives. The UN this past week, the General Assembly on Tuesday adopted 6 different resolutions in the General Assembly, and they were all anti-Israel. 6 of them. And that didn't quite make the headlines this past week. We also have seen this past week that the Pew Research Center reveals that 40% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 believe the government should be able to ban any speech. So this next generation says, you know what, if it hurts, if it's something that society doesn't agree with, if it's about Christ, the government has the right to say you can't talk about it anymore. That is 40% of this next generation of 18 to 34-year-olds coming into this society. We also saw this past week today, amidst the threats of the movement of a lot of Syrians and a lot of refugees. I also found out this other story about today that progressive psychologists in our country and in Europe have said that if a person recognizes homosexuality as sinful, that you can be labeled as mentally disordered. If you think homosexuality is sinful, according to as the Bible states, you can be labeled mentally disordered, and you can be taken from where you are and institutionalized. That's, you can think about that, we say, that's never going to happen, but crazier things have happened, and you just go back to 1938, 36 in Nazi Germany, just people thinking out loud were shipped off to Dachau and other places because of what they thought and because of what they expressed. I believe what we're seeing in our society is a consequence of us becoming more and more godless all the time. I wrote here that as humans and as created beings in God's image, in His image, God designed us with a mind, with a body, and with a spirit. When you take the spirit out of the picture, there are some severe consequences to contend with. Yeah, we got minds, we got bodies, but you take God out of the picture, there's problems. As we have talked about before, Anne Graham Lotz said that for several years now, Americans in a sense have shaken their fist at God and said, God, we want you out of our schools, out of our government, our business, and we want you out of our marketplace. And God, who is a gentleman, has just quietly backed out of our national and political life, our public life, removing His hand of blessing and protection. You don't want Him there? Okay. You don't need Him. I'll just back out of your life. Jay Leno said, with hurricanes, tornadoes, fires out of control, mudslides, floodings, severe thunderstorms tearing up the country from one end to another, and with the threat of bird flu and terrorist attacks, are we sure this is a good time to take God out of the Pledge of Allegiance? Once you start taking God out of the picture, there are severe consequences to contend with. And that's what we're finding right here at the tail end of the book of 1 Kings chapter 11. And Solomon's latter life, even though he started so great in trusting God and serving Him, Solomon's latter life serves as an example of the consequences of living apart from God. So you have his life starting out so wonderful, and then, like as we titled the series, this is the other side of the pendulum. Going from so great to going to so fallen in this context. You know, last week we talked about Solomon and what led to his downfall as a king, as a follower of God. It was his wives, and he started, in order to please his wives, he started sacrificing to different idols, and he had divided allegiances. And as we were talking about last week, that in order, when Satan tries to destroy our lives, he comes in to divide us and to conquer us. He comes in, gets us distracted on things that are not truly important in the scope of eternity. And if, like we were talking about last week, if he can distract you, then he can destroy you. And that's what happens right here in the end of chapter 11, is that Solomon so distracted on these allegiances and on prosperity that he destroyed him and began destroying the kingdom from the inside out. That's how I believe that our society will fall. I don't believe that, we're still, in all aspects, we are still the strongest military here on the face of this earth. So I don't believe that we're going to get a foreign power to come in and destroy us from the outside in. I believe that we're going to fall apart from the inside out. And that's the example from so many democratic societies and through so many empires that have come and gone. They always fall from the inside out. From corruption, from taking God out of the picture, from the mass of godless attitudes that are present within the society. They fall from the inside out. And so what we see happening with Solomon is that there was this inherent moral failure which resulted in several things. So if you're following along on your outline, number one, as a consequence of Solomon's abject moral failure, he was left prone to attack. So what God had told Solomon earlier is that if you fail to follow me, if you fail to obey my commands, then as a consequence, you're going to be open to different kinds of attacks. Now, what happened in this society, there's so many different individuals that attacked Solomon from the inside out. So let's take a look at what happens here in the passage. And so you skip ahead to verse 14, and then we're going to go all the way to verse 28 and just get a good understanding of what happens here. But there are three different individuals that are mentioned. You have Hadad, along with the Edomites. You have Rezon, and then you also have Jeroboam. So we're going to read about these individuals right here, beginning in verse 14. It says in verse 14, "Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad, the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom." Now you recall that Edom was descendant from Esau. So you have Jacob, represents Israel. You have Esau, representing the Edomites. And God said that these two brothers are going to bash heads for all time and eternity. Same thing that you have happening with Isaac and Ishmael. But here we have Jacob and Esau. You have the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, and now they are causing strife within the kingdom. Verse 15. "Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men of Edom." So we thought he cleaned out all. Then Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, just a little boy, he fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. Here he is, little boy, welling up with bitterness, and he's there in Egypt. Verse 18, "They set out from Midian, went to Paran. Then taking men from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. So here he is, in Egypt, grown up. Remembering many years ago, here's David, caused his family insult and massacred them in verse 19. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Taphanes, in marriage. Now you recall, who was one of the first individuals that Solomon married? It was Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, so you have one Pharaoh who gave another daughter, Taphanes, to this Hadad guy. And this guy was, his family was essentially massacred by David, Solomon's father. And then you have Solomon, who's married also to Pharaoh's daughter. And so you got this family just with a drama and a conflict that stems from their own parentage. Look at what happens. Verse 20, the sister of Taphanes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Taphanes brought up in the royal palace, and there Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his fathers, and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go, that I may return to my own country." "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." Here's a guy, many years later, said, "I'm going to head back to Israel. That David guy's dead, so let's see what we can stir up." So he comes in, he's a pseudo-relative of Solomon, and imagine the kind of conflict that he brings to the kingdom coming back there. It says in verse 23, not only you had Hadad, but God raised up against Solomon another adversary. His name was Rezon, son of Elida, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And he gathered men around him and became the leader of a band of rebels. When David destroyed the forces of Zobah, the rebels went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon lived in Aram and was hostile towards Israel. So you got one bad guy on top of that, you got another one, and they're all stirring this within the kingdom. Then you also have in verse 26, you have Jeroboam come to the place here. And it says also Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials. So where's the conflict coming? Is it coming from outside in? No, it's coming from the inside out. So here you have, right here, he was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here's the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built up the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. So this gives us a little bit of understanding of how this guy kind of wormed his way into authority, into the nation of Israel. But not only on top of that, look at what happens here in verse 29. After that time, Jeroboam is going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing, and he tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. One tribe, and also the tribe of the priest, the tribe of Levi as well." So the descendants of Solomon, of David, would have those 2 tribes, and then you have the 10 pieces of the cloak, which represents the northern kingdom, would be given over to Jeroboam. So here's Jeroboam, he's like, wow, I'm going to get my own kingdom, and God's going to give it to me. That's not bad. So verse 32, for the sake of my servant David, for the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this. Why? Because they have forsaken me and worshipped, remember those 3 idols we were talking about last week, Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the worst of all, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did. Now, what happens here is that a certain thing happens. Now, it says right there in verse 27, it says, this is the account of how he rebelled against the king. It began when Solomon started rebuilding the supporting terraces. Now, in the New American Standard and in the King James Version, it says that this was the Milo, that Solomon started rebuilding the Milo. Now, what does that mean? In Samuel, it is mentioned as a boundary of King David's construction while building up the city after the capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. So the King James Version footnotes the Milo as literally the landfill. So right here you have the Temple Mount where Solomon's palace would have been, the temple would have been, and then you have this little area right down here. It's a little slope, and it's called the Ophel. It's depicted right here. This is a modern day picture. They built up this one little area. This is the Temple Mount here, and over there, that's the Ophel. And right here, this would have been a kind of a rampart, kind of a big, kind of sloping area where they could easily start defending the city. It was kind of a big slope, kind of walled area. We spent a little time over at Mackinac Island this past summer, and over there they have this fort called Fort Mackinac. And over in this fort, they had these supporting terraces, these one little pathways where they could have little turrets and have a place where they could go and take out enemy soldiers and things like that. And so this was kind of like a little built-up area where they could start defending themselves properly over there in Israel. So the same kind of principle that you have in modern day defenses, this is what Solomon was doing. He was building up his walls so that he could easily defend it. Now this is the problem, is that Solomon, and this is the irony of the passage, that he was building up the walls in his kingdom in a physical way, but he was not building up the walls in his own heart. He was protecting his city, but he wasn't protecting his integrity. There's a great little message, and I've shared this before, but it's such a necessary message in these times, that the walls of our life are breaking down. This is from Eric Luby, and at one time I was going to serve alongside with him down in Colorado. This is from his ministry, Ellerslie, but he talks about how the walls of our life are broken down, and we built up all of these amazing structures in our life, and we have all the things that we need, but we lay down our guard for our hearts. But let's take a look at this, and it describes exactly what is happening in Solomon's life and also in our life today as a nation and as a people.
This is a statement in Isaiah basically saying the world is falling apart. Staring back at Israel, saying judgment is turned away backward, and justice stands afar off. For truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot. Once a God took him, and he saw that there was no man, and he wondered that there was no intercessor. An intercessor basically means one who fills the gap. If you have a walled city, and there is a hole in the walled city, there's this little part that is like broken down, it's like a pile of rubble. Actually, you can sneak through it. You know, there's a vulnerability in a time of war. If you have an enemy, what's an enemy looking for? The gate, to try and scale the gate. They're looking for breaches or holes in the wall. They're not stupid. They're not going to waste their time going through the front door and go through a side little broken down breach. So the enemy, by his very nature, is constantly watching the integrity of the wall. He's looking for holes. We have massive holes in our life that give the enemy access to do with our life what he sees fit to do. We can say, that's horrible, I'm a Christian. Yeah, you're a Christian with breaches. You are not supposed to be a Christian with breaches. One of the key definitions of Christianity could be a man or a woman whose walls are repaired, who is made strong. Why? So that they are useful to God. They're not just constantly inwardly fighting demons. They can be outward focused. God says to Israel, I will bless you so that you can become a blessing to the nations. God's pattern is to make you strong so that you're useful. There is a hedge that is supposed to be built up around your life, and it very likely isn't. You need a strong man. You need someone who can step in and fight off that enemy to make you strong so that you can start focusing outward instead of on your own issues. Most of us as Christians, the church is so weak because we have literally less than 1% of our time that is able to focus outward because we are so caught up in our issues and our difficulties. Even the healthiest among us, we have issues. We have difficulties, whether it's relational, whether it's financial, whether it's health, we have issues. And there's a dying world out there. You know, estimated 150,000 people died and went to hell today. Hey, let's think about this. What did we all do about it? Did we take a step forward in beginning to do something about it? Or are we just stemming the tide from our life falling apart even more than it is? We are living on the defensive instead of the offensive. What we need is the same thing God was looking for back then. The walls are broken down. The city is in disrepair. Israel is without a defender. Where's the intercessor? You know who Jesus Christ was? In a nutshell, he's the intercessor. He's the man who stands in the gap. He's the strong man who came and took the full blow upon himself so that we can gather our wits spiritually and awaken and say, I'm in. Thank you for rescuing me. Literally, he took the blow. Everything that was aimed right at you to absolutely decimate your life, he took it square on. Without even a whimper, he took it. For the joy that was set before him because he valued you so much. He took the blow. See, one of the things that happens with the life of Jesus, we have a tendency to make him a mousy character. We have a tendency to diminish his manly strength. We are talking about the greatest warrior of all time. In the Old Testament, the term is Lord of Hosts, the captain of captains, the general of generals. And he's the general who led his troops into battle with his own life. He's the one that did it. All the rest of the army was cowering in the background. They couldn't fight this army. And he stood up single-handedly and defeated them. That is our intercessor. That is our king. In the same way that he stood for you then, I want you to know, he still stands for you now. When you behold the cross, and you behold the resurrected Christ, when you behold the ascended Christ who sits at the right hand of the Father, you no longer will just remain where you are. You will say, God, do it all within me. For your glory, make me strong. Make me strong to give. God is looking for an intercessor. Someone who will make up this breach. We need to become a body that is thinking about every single one around us. As opposed to ourselves coming to church going, I need to be prayed for this week. What about who can I pray for this week? Just a different mindset. It's not what this church can do for you, but what you can do for Jesus Christ and this church. Think of that attitude shift. Saying, God, you made this life. You've called me for more than just to save me. You have rescued me so that I can become a rescuer. Who needs rescue? Who needs help? Who needs me to stand in the gap and take the hit? That's the attitude. It's not your skin and how you can save it. It's how you can spend it for His glory. His glory. For His glory. That is displayed right here in this chapter is of a man who had all that was going well. Built up all these walls and these defenses, built a great city, but he left one area of his life. There was a gap in it. You see, where Satan wants to attack us, it's in those little gaps. Those lapses of our judgment, when we fill our life up with pride, with greed, with lust, with envy. That's where he attacks us the most. And then what Jesus does is that he steps in and he steps into that gap and he defends us if we're saying, Lord, would you come and fill this gap in my life? That's where Solomon's downfall was. He had excluded God so much, he left these massive holes in his life, and that left him prone to attack. And so it's our responsibility as believers and as followers of God to say, Lord, I've got holes in my life. I recognize I've made mistakes. Would you come and fill those gaps for me? So that I can be effective, that I can defend, that I can take territory for you and not just be on the defensive all the time. Scripture says that we are more than conquerors through Him who has loved us. So why are we on the defense all the time? Why are we taking territory for Him instead of saying, oh, this red cup that defends me, they didn't say Christmas to me at the store. No, we're on defense all the time. Shouldn't we be out there taking territory for Him? That's because we've left so many little gaps in our life. So that's number one. As a consequence of Solomon's abject moral failure, he was left prone to attack. Number two, as a consequence of Solomon's divided loyalties, he exhibited a life that was on defense. He exhibited a life that was on defense. Now, in the previous section that we were studying last week, we read that since Solomon failed to obey God and he sacrificed to the gods of his foreign wives, God said, I will, and I'm reading right here, God says, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Now, someone who was given that kind of news, their reaction to this kind of bad news is going to be defensiveness. What we see happening in the rest of this chapter is a man increasing in paranoia and fear. So the previous section we were just reading last week, it says, okay, Solomon, you messed up. I'm going to take your kingdom away from you. All of a sudden, right here in the next little section, Solomon's just kneeling back and saying, okay, who's trying to take this away from me? He's in defense. And this happens throughout our society, throughout our culture. Individuals trying to hold on to power no matter what the means. You see,
you see Solomon becoming embittered and suspicious, and as a result, he begins alienating himself and those around him. It's symptomatic. If you look at society today, you have individuals like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. You have over there in Iraq individuals. Once they are threatened, Saddam Hussein, once they are threatened, you have a ruler or a leader who is in fear of losing their power. They will often act in paranoia and in defense, and they become self-protective. They start doing crazy things. They become cynical, suspicious, accusatory. Once they are threatened, they start putting up their defenses. You start seeing that in our relationships. You start seeing someone who's guilty. They start getting defensive when that opposition comes. You see that with our kids as well. It's symptomatic of kids when they're caught. Oh, did you do this? That they'll deny it or say, no, what? No, that was all him, or that was her over there. He did it. She did it. It's a human condition that once we are caught or have guilt, that we have a defensive posturing happening. And that's what's happening with Solomon here, is that, okay, Solomon, you messed up. And then we start seeing Solomon reel back and start trying to defend himself. Becomes accusatory. And I find it ironic that that same thing happens in today's universal church, that we're starting to play more defense than going out and playing offense. We are more blame shifters and suspicious and paranoid than going out and conquering territory for God. And often we do that with other churches. We are the strongest army in the world, but yet we shoot our own soldiers all the time. For example, and follow me on this, but let me give you a personal example. I worked with Pastor A one time, and he went and confronted another local Pastor B because Pastor B, did an outreach to the community and was serving people in Pastor A's church and invited them to go to church over at Pastor B's church. Okay, you sticking with me here? Okay, so even though Pastor B didn't know that those people went to Pastor A's church, so Pastor A went and made a huge deal over it and felt the need to confront Pastor B because Pastor A felt paranoid and competitive with Pastor B because a lot of Pastor A's people had left his church and went over to Pastor B's church, and this caused a rift in the ability of Pastor A to work with Pastor B, which resulted in increased paranoia of Pastor A's people to the suspicion of Pastor B's people. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, what? I'm like, this is so ridiculous. We're supposed to be going out there and reaching the lost, but we're having all this internal conflict and it's just like drama that I'm like, oh, can't we just see the big picture here? And I think that's the problem that Solomon had. Here you have a ruler, a leader who's in fear of losing power, and that individual will act in paranoia and defense. Become self-protective and cynical and suspicious and accusatory. And I see that happening universally in the church today, is that we become paranoid. We become prideful and arrogant. And we have divided loyalties, and we are more than conquerors, but I realize more and more that we are less than what Christ designed us for. And we're always on the defense rather than the offense. And that's what we see happening with Solomon. Unfortunately, what we see happening in the universal church today. Number 3, as a consequence of Solomon's choices, his descendants would be adversely affected. Look at what happens here. Verse 34. And God says, I'm gonna take the kingdom out of his hand, but I won't take the entire kingdom out of Solomon's hand. Look at verse 38. If you do whatever I command, you will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands as David my servant did. I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. As a result of this drama that's happening in Solomon's kingdom, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt to Shishak the king and stayed there until Solomon's death. As a trusted advisor, Solomon became suspicious and tried to kill him, and then that's the last that we hear about Jeroboam for the most part, but then he comes back on the scene a couple chapters later. We won't dig into that right now. But look what happens, verse 41. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. What you see happening from Solomon's time for the next several hundred years is that the sins of the father will be passed on to the sons and their sons after. And it continues for generations after. You see that happening right here, and you'll see that happening even in our own lives. That if we do not build up these breaches and these holes in our life, these sins will continue on and on and on. I've seen that in my own family. In my father's family, there was a culture of anger and of violence and struggle that was there in the Philippines, and if somebody offended you, it was not uncommon that you would just lash out and hit them. My father even once told me of a time that he was living with his grandmother at the time. And he and his cousin had an argument. They were about 6 or 7 years old. They were having an argument at the time, and they were fighting together. And then my father went home to Grandma's house, and Grandma just got in his face and in all seriousness said, "You know what? What we need to do is we're going to pick up your cousin, we're going to bring him home, we're going to kill him, and we're going to eat him." And my father believed it because that was the culture of that tribal influence back there, is that she just got in his face and said, "We're going to do this. We're going to eat him." And he believed her, and he said, "No, I'm not going to fight with him anymore. We're going to get along with him. I don't want to eat my cousin." Things like that. And my dad, I remember him telling me the story, he was laughing about it, and I'm like, there was a culture of anger and of violence and of drama and of bloodshed that existed in my family. And my dad, when he came to the United States, he had a choice of either forsaking that culture of anger and violence and saying, "I'm not going to pass this on to my children." The sins of the father can be passed on to the next generation, the second and the third, according to the Old Testament. But we have a choice as individuals to say, "No more." You may see that in your own family. You may have a cycle of anger and of violence, but you can say, "It's not going to continue with me anymore. I'm going to choose to have God stand in those gaps in my life, and I'm going to be on the offense for Him rather than the defense."
Amen.
Let me give you a more practical example. You see this happening with Solomon, the sins passing on to Rehoboam and his sons after, and it continues for generations after. But look at this example. Some of you may have seen this before, but there was an author, it was Richard L. Dugdale. Back in 1874, he was employed by the New York Prison Commission to visit state prisons, and he visited a number of prisons, and he found that several of these individuals that were in these prisons were descended from a guy by the name of Max Jukes. And he found the Max Jukes guy, who was born around 1720. They found, because of his behavior, his descendants, out of his life, that 310 of the 1,200 of his descendants were professional paupers. Professional poor people, 1 in 4. 300 of those died in infancy from lack of care. 50 women lived lives of notorious debauchery. 400 men and women were physically wrecked early by their own wickedness. 7 were murderers. 60 were habitual thieves who spent on the average 12 years each in lawlessness. And you had 130 convicted criminals. What is not mentioned there is that they wound up back in 1800 costing the state about $1,500,000. All of these descendants from one guy. One guy made bad decisions and he passed those things on to the next generation. Another guy came on the scene, and by the name of, in 1879, A.U. Winship was asked by a scholarly organization to prepare a paper on Jonathan Edwards back in 1703. And here's a man who followed the Lord, who desired to fulfill all of his will in his own life. And look at what happens. Kind of the same generation, but out of Jonathan Edwards, you had 1 U.S. vice president. That was Aaron Burr. 3 U.S. senators, 3 governors, 3 mayors, 13 college presidents, 30 judges, 65 professors, 80 public office holders, 100 lawyers, and 100 missionaries, pastors, and theologians. You see the difference one person can make? One person who would say, I choose the way of the Lord, and then you have one person who says, I choose my own way. And how many people are affected by one man, by one woman's decision? Look at what happens with the nation of Israel. This would be the case for Solomon. One man makes bad decisions, fails to support those breaches in his life, and then for generations afterwards, you would see a cycle that would not stop for 3 generations. It would continue for almost 900 years. That God would finally provide a solution to the problem of this cycle of violence and of anger and debauchery. God would eventually provide Christ and end this cycle by bringing a Redeemer and an intercessor in their life. With Solomon, we see from one side of the pendulum to another. A man who started out so great, but then came to the other side. This is the cycle of every single nation that has existed on this earth. This is that quote that we've been using this whole entire time from Alexander Fraser Clifford or Lord Woodhouse Lee. He said, nations have always progressed from the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence. And then when you become dependent on the society, you go back into bondage. If we fail to learn the lessons of history, we are doomed to repeat it. That is the situation we find ourselves here in these United States. Are we dependent upon the society and upon our own good works, upon our money, or are we dependent upon the living God and upon all that He is? Because when I see that when we're dependent upon the living God, let's go back here, when we're dependent upon the living God, you find spiritual faith, you find courage, you find liberty, you find abundance. But when we're dependent upon those other things and when we exclude Him out of our life, the result is always, always, always bondage. God allowed these attacks and these conflicts to happen in Solomon's life because he uses those things to turn people's hearts back to him. I find he still does that today with us. Even with all the strife that we find in our society, he uses those things to say, do you trust me? Or are you going to turn your life over to me? Take a look at this example right here. This is why trials happen in our life. This is why we're going through trials in our society, because we should consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith, it produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Blessed is that man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. You see why God allows this trial to happen in our life as a nation, to happen in your own personal lives? Because he wants to purify you, make you stronger. He wants to make you more like him, and he's going to do every single thing to win your heart to the point of saying, okay, son, daughter, I do need to discipline you, and it hurts, but I want the best for your life. That's why trials happen. These trials that we go through as a nation, as individuals, should not pull us from God, but it should make us run towards Him. There's one little clip I'd like to share with you right here at the end. The little boy calls on the radio station and finds that even in this little trial that he was going through, that God was trying to draw his heart towards him. I think this serves as a great example to all of us. Let's take a look. This is Logan talking on Sky Angel, the radio program. Take a look.
Hey Mike, can I talk to you?
You bet, Logan. What's up?
I want to tell you something that God just told me.
Okay.
Last night my dad was roping this calf. And this calf had been born from a really old cow. She didn't have really the greatest milk. She didn't have like the vitamin C and stuff.
Okay.
Hold on.
So cute, I guess his mom talked.
I'm talking to all the other stuff. But sorry about that. But anyway, she broke her back. And this morning I went out and put her down myself. I was talking to God. I was asking God why she was special. And God said, you know, Logan, my son was special, but he died for a purpose. It's kind of the same thing. That calf was close to me, and God's son was close to him.
Logan, you're so right. It's true. Think you're gonna be okay?
Yeah, I'll be fine. But I just wanted to tell you guys that is so important. Just remember, when you lose a loved one or a pet, always remember that God gave His Son too, and He understands. He will always understand. He will always just run to Him.
Logan, you're wiser than you know, buddy.
Well, sometimes I don't think I'm wise. Trust me, I've done a lot of stupid stuff. But I learned from it.
Yeah, but see, buddy, that's what makes you wise. Somebody that learns from their mistakes.
Oh, I just figured I'd better call and share with you guys. Love you.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Just like little Logan, these trials of our life should not pull us from God, but it should make us run to Him. He knows what you're facing. Those temptations, those trials, those hurts. tell you he understands. Just like little Logan said, he will always understand. Just run to him. Just run to him. In this book, we have found a man who ran from God. As a result, suffered the consequences of it. But when we as people run to him, he will always be there. He will never leave us or forsake us. Just run. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. God, you know what we're going through today. You know the struggles we face, and you realize, and we realize the gaps, those breaches in our walls and our defenses. God, would you stand in those gaps so that we can be more effective for you? Would you today, amidst our trials, within our suffering, within the temptations, those hurts, Lord, help us to know that you understand what we're going through, and so we run to you. We say, God, with open arms, with open hands, we're laying aside those things, and we're coming to you and saying, Lord, take us. Take me, take all of me. I reserve none for myself. And in that act of surrender, Lord, you have promised to be with us. You have promised to give us all that we need for this life. And so, God, with an act of surrender and of humility, you have all of us, heart, mind, soul, and strength. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for the truths of this book. Would you apply these truths to our lives throughout this week, to our co-workers, to our own lives, to the way we interact with our families, with our husbands, our wives, our kids, our fellow students. That's our desire, God. We love you. We pray all this in the name of Jesus, our Savior. And all God's people said.